So a little bit about this art show is about a year and a half ago, Aaron Weitzel-Jones, our archivist on staff here, and I started investigating the artwork that we had downstairs. All these pieces that you see on the wall were wrapped up in brown craft paper, and we didn't know what they were. Well, we knew they were art. We'd opened like one or two, but we didn't know the scope of them. There's about 350 pieces, and as we opened them up, when we finally had time to open them up amongst our other duties, every package was like Christmas morning. We didn't know what was going to be in them. Was it going to be something like this? Was it going to be more of a photographic style from the 1970s or so? We just didn't know. So we had great fun opening those up. Everything was a surprise. And after we unwrapped quite a few, we realized that we had a real treasure here and that we needed to show them to the public. So that's when the idea of having a public art show came about. We knew we were going to look for an art expert, and we found one, but I'll let Aaron tell you about him in a minute. So Aaron and I have worked a lot on this, as have several other people. We want to thank Mosaic Media and also OB Credit Union for helping us with some donations of time and money and helping us market and produce this show. And one person, and I don't see her at the moment, but she'll stand up and wave her hand, who's helped out a tremendous amount is Megan Ackerman, who is our assistant curator. There she is in the back. She's smiling and doing the parade wave thing, yeah. So she came on board a few months ago as assistant curator. She is smart, she's enthusiastic, she's very devoted to historical accuracy, which are all tremendous assets for anyone who wants to work in the history or the museum field. So we're very pleased that Megan was able to help us out on this. We also got a Thurston County Heritage Grant for helping to not to put on the art show so much, but to process all the art, to get it out of those old craft paper wrappings and into a controlled environment, into acid-free storage boxes, so that hopefully this art that has been stored for a long time and miraculously is still vibrant and colorful and meaningful will continue to be preserved over the years. So I think that's probably enough there. Oh, I should mention also that Megan is going to be giving a talk of her own next March here on our regular Thursday noon talks. And she's going to be talking about her master's thesis, which she got through with this May at Washington State University. She did her thesis on the history of, guess what, Olympia Brewing Company. And she is working with WSU Press to turn that thesis into a manuscript for a book. So we wish her the best of luck, because that will be a well-documented, well-sourced, complete history of the Olympia Brewing Company. So we hope that finds a ready market here. And now I'm going to introduce Aaron Weitzel-Jones, who will introduce somebody else.
Hi. As Karen mentioned earlier, she's a museum curator. She's used to dealing with all kinds of different artifacts. I'm an archivist. I'm used to dealing with paper, but neither of us had ever confronted 400 artworks before. So when we first started planning a show here, we knew we wanted to hire a guest curator to come and pick out the strongest pieces to display in the show, figure out how we were going to display them on the walls, and interpret them for our audience. And as it turned out, it was not easy at all to find somebody who knew advertising history, who knew art and design, and could put all of that in the Pacific Northwest context. So we were so relieved and grateful when we found Art Chantry. Art is a nationally known poster artist and graphic designer. His work is in the collections of museums nationwide. He has had a solo show at MoMA in New York and taught at the college level. And this year he won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Institute for Graphic Arts. Here he is, Art Chantry.
Well, hi everybody. Sorry about the delay. I set this whole show up on my computer at home, and I brought it over here, and it was a different computer, and it didn't read the little clicky thingies, and all heck broke loose. So I want to thank the people here at Tumwater for hiring me in the first place. you know, John and Karen and Aaron and Megan have been like family. They're just like a wonderful little group of people. They're absolutely, oh, there's John back there. Hey, John. They're just like the sweetest, most wonderful people I've ever worked with. And I've worked with a lot of people, and these guys are really, really nice. Karen in particular is like a force of nature, you know. If you ever want anything done, a mountain moved, perhaps a new, you know, pyramid or something, she's the gal to go to because she can do it. It's just amazing. Let's see, a couple words about the stuff on the walls here. There's actually, I assume that for a lot of you, this is the first time you've looked at this stuff, or, you know, I don't know, maybe you've seen it already, but I want to point out there's actually a structure to what's being presented here. In the first room that you walk in, that's the oldest stuff. That's all from the 1930s. You have to keep in mind that Olympia beer started off as Capital Brewing. I'm telling this to the converted already. In 1896, then in 1897, it changed its name to Olympia. And then in 1916, it closed down for the Prohibition and stopped brewing. We were a little ahead in this state over the rest of the country, so it actually had to stop earlier. Spent the next 10 years or so bottling other odd things, soda pops, apple juices, water. And then when Prohibition ended in 1932, they started to make beer. It took a couple years. They started selling beer again in 1934. Now, the stuff in the room, the first room, actually dates back to that very, very first year they went back into production into the modern company we know today, or knew today. So that's like really right from the very, very beginning. In fact, there's one piece in there I'm pretty sure is probably their very first piece of advertising, you know, after Prohibition. It goes back that far. When you hit the wall to go into the next room, there's a few pieces from World War II, which is a totally different era. Basically, in World War II, all the regular artists and advertising people that they worked with all went to fight the war effort, and they had to work with people left behind, which were like non-professionals, perhaps students, perhaps people who'd left the industry and come back. So the work is a little less sophisticated and a little bit more, you know, patriotic, but it's a very odd lurch. In the history of advertising, there's this odd lurch around World War II. And when it came back, it was all European influenced, and obviously because of the war. The next room is the kind of the glory years of the domestic post-war baby boom, silent majority, blah, blah, blah years, the good years, the Beaver Cleaver years. So the images in there, that one wall is all these billboard images that just says Olympia real big over and over and over and over again. That was just kind of fun to just create this sledgehammer kind of approach. And the other images are all these domestic tranquility images. You know, if women are in the pictures, they're serving their men, or they're buying their man some beer, and the men are all handsome and doing outdoors activities like sailing their sailing boats and stuff. Then you come into this room, and we have like two odd kinds of things here. They did an awful lot of images with flowers for the billboards. Everybody loves flowers. They're so pretty and all that. And everybody likes to paint them, and it was always a good solution no matter what time of year. So a big percentage of the stuff we found in the pile were like images of flowers, and that's just a small selection from the images of the flowers. On that wall is actually all one campaign. One advertising came from 1937 that were all still lifes. They were actually, those really stood out because they were more sophisticated design-wise and had a more Art Deco kind of influence, 30s modern kind of influence. Considering that was done at the height of the Depression. You know, it's an interesting contrast to see. Then you get down to here, this is where the real marketing was. This was Boys with Toys territory here. You know, you got guys out fishing and out their horses, they got their sail caps, you know, they got their golf clubs, and you know, this suspicious looking group here, I don't know what they're up to. So it's like, this is where the real heart and soul of it was. They knew their market very, very well. They knew who to sell their beer to. Another interesting thing about the stuff before I start that I should point out is you see how, like particularly, that's a good example right there, but around the outside edges of these images, there's all this really goopy, ugly, yellow, crummy looking smeary stuff. That is old rubber cement. At one point in its history, we have no idea when, these things had little cardboard frames glued around them so they could put them in an art show and show off their work, you know. Over the years, the glue dried up, failed, the things fell off, this glue turned incredible yellows and browns and stuff. That isn't supposed to be there, but this art isn't supposed to be here. I mean, this is actually probably the first time in this entire artwork's existence that they've been hung in a gallery and looked at by people as if it were artwork, because they're not art. These are production images. These are production illustrations as part of the advertising process. They would basically, there's an ad agency, they'd hire artists, they'd work with the client to create an image. They would create the image, and then they'd make a poster. Back in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s, even into the 1960s, when we said posters in the advertising biz, that was a lot different than what we think of as a poster today. Poster today, we see a little piece of paper that you hung on the wall, maybe a couple thumbtacks, you know, that's a poster. No, these are billboards. Back in the old days, when they said poster, they meant billboard. That's what a poster was. These were all billboard images. Now, obviously, they're a heck of a lot smaller than a billboard, and I'll be going into how these things were produced a little bit. But what's interesting, really fascinating for me, is that as Olympia left the Schmidt family and went into a number of other hands in consecutive years, it finally ended up with the hands of some people who pretty much gutted the buildings, left them in the sad condition. It breaks your heart to see those things with no backside on the thing, and they're completely empty. When they were basically recycling, let's be nice, recycling the buildings, whoever, some workman, maybe a manager or something, went into the offices, and there was all this paperwork and all these files and all this stuff. And rather than just throwing it in a dumpster, which is where that stuff usually goes when these kind of takeovers happen, they brought it over to this building, which was sitting fairly unused at that point, and they took it down the basement and just threw it in a big pile. And that is how this stuff survived. Originally, the Schmidt family, being thrifty, they saved everything, saved this stuff. Then it just basically went through hand after hand after hand, forgotten. And then instead of throwing it in the dumpster, some kind person said, "This is kind of cool. We should do so. We can't throw this out." And they threw it in the basement here and ended up with this incredible stash of advertising art. This stuff was never meant to survive the advertising process. The artist would make this image. They'd transfer it onto the big poster, aka billboard, and then afterwards, the printer, the billboard maker, would probably stick it in their files for a while. Then after a while, they'd clean out the files, and it would go in the garbage. That's where all of this artwork ended up in American history. Very little of this stuff survives. So the fact that we actually have a stash of 300-400 original pieces for one company in one find is just, I've never encountered anything like it. I've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff. This is a real blowout. I mean, it's just like mind-boggling collection. And as time went on, we did a lot of research trying to figure out. I want to thank Stan Shaw, who's back there, and Chuck Pennington. I don't know if he's here, but they both helped do a lot of research, as did, of course, Karen and Aaron and Megan. And it was like, it found out some really interesting things about a lot of this stuff. And that's what I'm going to kind of try and talk to you guys about right here. That's the Olympia beer label. You might recognize it. You know, some of you folks. Who designed that label and logo is kind of lost to history. There's been a lot of people who've claimed they did it, but it was really hard trying to find evidence. So much of this stuff goes undocumented. The history of advertising, particularly during the earlier years, is largely lost. People did not bother to even people didn't even sign a lot of this artwork. A lot of the stuff, we just don't even know who did it, because it just wasn't considered worthy. Most of these guys made a living, their real art was like doing paintings they sold in galleries, you know, landscapes, Mount Rainier, pretty flowers, watercolors. And they did this to support themselves on the sides, and they weren't very proud of this stuff. This was junk. So they didn't even care about this stuff once it went in, and they sure didn't want their names on a lot of this stuff. So it was, nowadays we recognize it as really spectacular stuff. Nobody can paint or draw like this anymore. It is literally, you're looking at lost styles that nobody knows how to do anymore. I've actually tried to hire people to do stuff that looks like this. People can't. Professional illustrators can't paint like this. They can't do this anymore. It's all lost. So, I mean, this is like really an interesting piece of history. It's an interesting piece of art and culture. That's Leopold Schmidt. He's the guy who founded this brewery. He started from scratch, an old German guy. Well, actually, he was a young German guy at one point, as we all were. A lot of these images, because we had to do a last-minute scrounge in the basement and stuff, are a little taxing. I hope you can actually see them. That's actually a postcard of the Olympia Brewing Company. You know, I mean, we all grew up. Many of you lived next to it. I used to come down here and do the tour when I was a kid, so I'd get that free beer. You know, it was beautiful. It built this huge company. It was one of the finest breweries in America. Certainly the single most dominant brewery on the entire west coast of the United States. I mean, it was just a huge powerhouse, great beer. Everybody loved it. It was all part of our lives. Sorry for the model. We fired him immediately after this photo. He just couldn't stop clowning around. And this is originally the slide I was going to talk about the glue on the sides of the things, but that's like everybody's favorite image that came out of this collection. To kind of give you can kind of get an idea of the size of these things. That was one of the larger ones and what was going on. We generally call that one the George Bailey, you know, because of the It's a Wonderful Life thing. But it was actually from 1939, so it predates It's a Wonderful Life by nearly a decade. So inside my heart, I say Bing Crosby. But never mind that. See, Olympia kind of, over the years, it started off kind of slowly, you know, and had their usual kinds of trucks. But in the 60s heyday, I mean, it was beautiful. You saw that truck coming down. I remember that truck, and it was like, it really looked like gold, you know? It looked like a chariot of beer. This is how economically and socially powerful this brewery was. It was just gigantic. It owned 63% market share or something like that. It was just blam. It blew everybody else out of the water. That's a joke, water. See, it's the water. The phrase "it's the water" was created by a guy named Frank Kenny, who was Leopold Schmidt's secretary. Frank Kenny, he was the one who suggested the "it's the water" to refer to the water. We all know about the water, and that advertising phrase stuck with it the rest of its existence. In fact, they still use it today on the fourth or fifth generation versions of the cans. Of course, by the time I got to the fourth or fifth generations, it lost a lot of its class. Yeah, this is only today, folks. Rolling only. Yeah, nothing lasts forever. When I say billboards, this is what I'm talking about. See, back in those days, billboards weren't like those ghastly things we see going by the Indian reservation. They were everywhere. They were treated with a certain amount of respect and dignity. Look at they have a nice picture frame, a trellis plantings. They would have plantings. Sometimes they'd have little flower beds with posies up there, and they tried to not make them eyesores. But that was at the beginning. We got tired of all that extra work after a while. But you can see look at how fancy the pylons on it and everything like that. But this is what these things were used for. This image that big, and these are the little ones. And this is what, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when the world looked like that, And we passed laws, and Lady Bird Johnson was one of the big push behind it, and we got rid of the billboards. We still have billboards, obviously. And when you got to a certain point, and we look at the cutoff point as about 1960 or so, they switched from the illustration imagery to more photographic imagery. There's a lot of stuff in the basement that is also photographic generated billboard art from the 60s, later years. Still highly hand worked, but they're photographs of people drinking beer rather than paintings of people fishing and drinking beer, This is, again, the quality is bad, but I'm sorry. This thing I'm showing you, because you can see all the folds in it, that is like a printed billboard that was printed on a printing press, laid out and photographed. You can see the folds. It's busted up, it's tiled. That's at least six big pieces of paper laid out and registered on the ground to photograph it. Billboards were manufactured that way. I mean, that was just one way. There's several ways to do that stuff. But to give you an idea just how big these pieces of paper were, that gives you a little tiny corner. Now, the association here doesn't have, that's like a piece of the one single actual physical billboard they have in their collection. To collect billboards, you got to have a lot of room, you know. But you can still get the original unused billboards for a lot of this material out there. There are companies that find stashes of this old stuff and then sell them as collectibles, and people collect billboards. Figure that one out. Oh, that's Megan, by the way. She's the one who was, the one who mentioned earlier. But there's this bigger size billboard. And this is like huge. Look how big that thing is compared to the other things. You see that? Painted bulletins, 365. Those, because they got that big, they really couldn't print them and figure out the technology to do it photographically and enlarge it that big. So they were hand painted. There was a career. I know people there's a certain age bracket where it stops. But I know people who actually made a living painting billboards up until about 20 years ago. The idea of actually taking the artwork, looking at it, and doing that on that scale was just a job you could get, you know. They weren't paid well. Like, the artists weren't paid well. Nobody's paid well except the advertisers. Now here's the actual original artwork for that same image right there. We happen to have that. It's hanging on the wall back over there. If you go way back by the door in that room, there's these long, skinny ones. Those are the ones for these giant billboards. They went from that small to things that big. Now you notice they're so big, the artists and the designers and the manufacturers, the billboard makers, don't really know what to do with all that space. You see how on the sides they just put these pretty bands of decoration? They didn't know what else to put there. They couldn't come up with it, you know. They also tended to be a lot simpler design-wise. You don't see people or horses or, you know, bottles. Well, you do see a bottle. If you see the designs back there, they're much more simplified because it took so much effort and work to paint them by hand up there. So they tried to stay away from complex imagery, things like that. A lot of this artwork, the back sides are covered with fingerprints, and particularly right here. Some of them, they're like paint fingerprints. And what's cool is that's where the sign painter who was transferring this, you know, this is called the art, the advertising art, the illustration. In the fine art world, they call it a maquette, you know, but it's this. They hold it in one hand, still got paint all over it, and they're painting with the other, so they're covering the fingerprints on the back where they do that. Is that marvelous or what? You can actually, a lot of the sign painters' actual fingerprints are on these things. See, and you might notice that most of them are printed on just artboard, cardboard that they would get at their art supply outfit. Some of the logos on those things are pretty spectacular. Now, this is another one that I think that one's out there. I'm not 100% sure. But and you might notice the date on that little piece of brown paper, 1934. That one is actually from 1934, and it's when they first started making ads after not making ads for the Prohibition. You have to go way back 20 years before you could. So what they would do is they would literally take old cardboard printed things, maybe off the case of beer, and cut it out with a scissors and glue it on. And then they'd paint in the lettering around it. That's why they're so yellowed, is because they've aged. They're pre-printed. When you're transferring something by painting it, you know, it doesn't matter if you're finding an image that's really, really crude because it transfers through the painter onto the wall and he makes it look nice. If they were doing this photographically, like we print everything today, you couldn't get away with doing that because it would show up looking really terrible. But back then, this is the way they were approaching it because it was still very primitive. They're kind of like relearning how to do a lot of this stuff. Now, the ad agency of note, of record for Olympia beer stayed real consistent for a very, very long time. It was Botsford, Constantine, and Gardner. This is their letterhead from 1934, about the same time as that last image I showed you. If you read the fine print, there's some conflict of interest between Acme and Olympia's advertising styles that they were trying to deal with there in this little piece there. But they were a San Francisco-based ad agency. They had offices in New York. They had offices in, I think they had some in the South. They had some in Denver. And they had one in Seattle. And I think the Seattle office was opened strictly to service Olympia at first, but I'm sure they were able to pick up other accounts in the city with that much business going on in it. But this gives you an idea, just the idea that a West Coast ad agency, the history of advertising, such as it's documented, and it's documented very poorly, it's all New York centric. Everything that we see that's advertising comes out of New York. That's what we all think and assume, and this is what they assume. But just having an agency that's this big and powerful with all these offices all over the place in the country, it's like, nobody's ever heard of these guys. I mean, why don't we know who they are? Why don't we know who these artists are? Just because it turns out they're all West Coast artists. I mean, as a graphic designer and an illustrator, I lived in Seattle for decades. I spent a lot of time with my friends trying to, research the history of what we do. It's just one of my obsessions. Strangely, the history of Seattle advertising and graphic design only traces back till about the Seattle World's Fair. And that's when the first real graphic design studio opened up in Seattle. Ad agencies had been around for much, much, much longer, but there's literally no documentation. It kind of goes into this big blank zone. It's like, we could not figure out who any of these people are, and when we did, we'd never heard of them. And they're like, these are nationally known illustrators, and they were operating out of Seattle, out of Tacoma, out of Portland, and nobody knows who they are. And it's just the nature of the biz. This was considered junk. This was the stuff they did to make a living, and it got thrown away. Their real stuff hung in a gallery, their watercolors. So they end up with these dual kinds of histories that you have to dig beneath the surface to find out who actually did these things. Now, this is an interesting thing. This is actually an invoice for one of their billboards or posters, and I'm going to try and point. It says 40 24-sheet poster showing starting December 1st, 1934. That means 40 posters, aka billboards. 24-sheet means is 24 pieces of tiled paper, wallpapered onto it, spread all up and down the West Coast. For 1 month of advertising, let me see if I can see that a little bit, $880. Hey, I don't think you get a postage stamp for that. Now, cost of hand paints per poster, $10. Since there's 40 posters, that's $400. That's for the hand painted parts. That's how much they pay. Now, there's the total, about 1,000 there, and then it says artist sketch of design, $25. Wow. And we know how to pick our careers around here. And I just want you to know that the pricing has not changed in all that time. Now, this is an interesting flyer that's found. See, one of the interesting things that was in this huge pile of papers was it wasn't just this artwork. It was all kinds of files, all kinds of invoicing, all this ancient stuff. Did you know that every employee that ever worked from 1933 to 1977 thereabouts, everybody who ever worked at Olympia Beer was photographed, an identity mugshot. And those files were in that pile of paper. Down in the basement, organized, they've got photographs of all the people that ever worked here. Is that cool? I mean, what an amazing asset. Nobody's really examined them because it's just so overwhelming, So there's invoices and stuff like this. You might recognize that little image at the bottom, and I can see it straight through the doorway here. It's like this piece and this little promo newsletter is basically talking about their new campaign. Now, this is the first year they started selling beer, Olympia beer, after Prohibition. So this is from 1934. It's dated July, but it's for a campaign that was going to come out that autumn. And it's a big campaign. They got several hundred, 355 billboards in 54 cities. I can't read it from this angle. And that was the billboard, and the original art is right there. And they sent this out as a blurb to people and places to try and solicit excitement. It's like, what do they call it? A press release. It's a press release. Isn't that a nice looking press release? interestingly, we were able to actually trace who the artist was. His name was Edwin Burnley. Now, Edwin Burnley was an interesting person in the Northwest history of Northwest advertising, because later on in life, in 1946, in the post-war era, he opened up Burnley's School of Professional Design in Seattle. And for 30 plus years, it was the graphic commercial art school in the entire Northwest quadrant of the United States. It trained generations of artists, photographers, illustrators, you name it, copywriters, all kinds of branch off things. That's Burnley's. It's up on Capitol Hill. The building is still there. It's a famous haunted building. It's got a ghost. There's been documentaries and stuff done about it. So I mean, it's a famous ghost in the building. It changed hands. Lee Cawthorne bought it, did another 20 years. And then they sold it to the Art Institute people. So the Art Institute of Seattle started off as Burnley's. And that's the history of Edwin Burnley in the region. As far as I know, I've never seen any of his graphic design work before. This is the only piece I've ever seen. And I've been really interested in this stuff all my life. And there just doesn't seem to be any that exists. This is like really a unique little thing. Now, Edwin Burnley was a watercolorist. Now, a lot of these guys, like I said, were artists for real, doing illustration, commercial art to make a buck, to pay their rent, That's a real hard way to make a living, I'll tell you. But he was, this is one of his paintings. Now, his watercolor, a lot of these guys seem to have been watercolors, started off as watercolorists. This is, interestingly, in Seattle, there's a part of town that was known as Denny Hill. Now it's called Belltown. Now, Denny Hill was a hill that was really big, like Queen Anne Hill, and it just stuck there. And back in the beginning of the century, they decided that the people who owned the city up there said, well, we want to get rid of this here hill. So they literally removed this hill and sluiced it out into the bay and extended the shoreline. And in the process, there were people who wouldn't sell their property. And so what happened, and there are photographs of this stuff, is that they would basically remove the hill around the house and leave the house on this little pile of dirt. And some of these things were they had them stacked up on pallet boards and stuff up there. What's interesting about this is one of the famous hills, or one of the famous buildings that was left on the thing, because here's an actual photograph of the same building. So that's what Burnley did for his art. What he did for money is he taught other people to do illustration and design in this school with a ghost. Now, one of the people, a lot of these pieces here are associated with this company, which is down in San Francisco, LNC. LNC stands for Logan and Cox. They were, one way that graphic designers and commercial illustrators were able to make a living is they formed firms. It made them look like a team. It made them look like professional. They would wear their little suits and go out for meetings and stuff like that. But in truth, it was a little room with two guys at drawing boards and painting easels. And so they'd make these really professional-looking stickers to put on their artwork. It's a technique that's still done today. You go out there and you run into this kind of stuff all the time. They look like a big outfit, and you get to their house and they're basically working out of their basement. That kind of thing. Logan and Cox. There was originally a third member, but he left very quickly. They were two, again, watercolorists. Maurice Logan, and Willard Cox. This is a Willard Cox. There's another Willard Cox over there. Maurice Logan, see if I can spot one over there. The middle one that's got the, on the far side that says Season's Greetings, the dark one with the orange, that's Maurice Logan. Now, what these guys did is they were watercolorists, and Maurice Logan in particular was he was a sharp businessman and he could present. It's like one of the first things he did in his life was he went out and he bought himself a really natty double-breasted suit back in the 30s, and when he walked in, he was better dressed than the advertising agency guys. He had his portfolio case. He really came in and made a great presentation, and he became very powerful. He became one of the biggest illustrators in the United States at that point, working out of San Francisco. How was that even possible? But in truth, he was a watercolor artist. artist. And what he really wanted to do is paint his watercolors. So he formed an arts group called the Society of Six. And what they were is 6 watercolor artists that showed their work together and sold out of a single gallery and stuff. And later on in life, there's another organization called 23 Watercolors, also set up by Maurice Logan. And basically, he would recruit other watercolors he liked their work and bring them into the Society of Six. That would give him status in the museum and gallery world. And at the same time, they become part of Logan and Cox. That's where Willard Cox came from. He was one of the Society of Six, the Sinister Six, as I like to call them. And so they became partners, but it was Logan's game. He was the head honcho, and Cox was every bit his equal, and maybe in some respects better as an image painter, artist, but it was Logan's game, and he was the one who went out and landed the accounts. This is a guy who's really proud of himself. Here's a self-portrait. You can see how, if you did a self-portrait of yourself, would you make yourself look like that? What kind of mind would do that? I'm so important. I mean, I'm going to be poking fun at these guys because it was a different era, and we did things differently back then. We thought differently. This is Willard Cox. Unfortunately, the only photo I could find of the guy, that's one of the things you're going to find here, is like the photos I could find of these people, they were taken much later in life. I just couldn't find. Researching online is so restricting. I would have to go research families and visit families and stuff to get better things. But that's Willard Cox. Now, here's what Maurice Logan's work looked like. This is from about, I believe, 1939. That's not only the number, it's actually the year it was done. One of the weird things is you see that label on the bottle there. One of the things you'll notice when you look at a lot of these, the labels were literally printed on a piece of paper somewhere. And what they would do is they give these sheets of the labels to the artists, and they would literally cut them out and glue them on. Most of these things are glued on. There was a piece of artwork here that was glued on that fell off over the years, The other thing that's real interesting about Maurice Logan is that he didn't want to be bothered by certain aspects of the project. Like he thought it was beneath him. You might notice that the Pilsner glass with the beer in it, the yellow liquid, you notice how there's no bark reflection or distortion coming through that glass transparent image at all. That's because he didn't want to bother. One of the things you'll see about Maurice Logan is he just didn't want to bother. Some of these other guys, this is a Willard Cox, he really got off on playing with the distortion. And what you begin to see is like every artist approached this problem differently. There's one of the places where they found a challenge. And you'd see, and I became really fascinated by the way the different artists would deal with that reflection. Some of them did very detailed diffractions. Other people did these vague amoebic shapes, And it's really fascinating to see how they tackle these things. But Maurice Logan just couldn't be bothered with that stuff. So his are always just plain blank yellow sheets with some smear in it. And the beer bottles also, one of the other things I really find a lot of entertainment is because of the type of label they had printed with the distortion on it, that perspective, the bottles all look like the same bottle. And that's simply because they had to paint a bottle that would go with that clipped out label. So it was always seen from this perspective where it was photographed. And as a result, you start seeing the same bottle show up simply because that's the label they had to work with. And look at the bottles closely. One of the things that a lot of these guys got off on was painting the foam inside the bottle. And everyone approaches it a little different. How do you paint foam inside of a brown beer bottle? Well, learn, take a look. I mean, there's some amazing solutions, So those kind of little aspects really entertain me. Here's another Maurice Logan. He did this jumping, he did trouts, and he just did really beautiful, elegant work. This is like from 1936. That's how early he was working with Botsford, Constantine, and Gardner on the Olympia account. At first, he was doing most of the Olympia account because he seemed to really want that because he ran Logan and Cox. But after a while, he kind of disappears, and Willard Cox ends up doing. And I think Willard Cox probably has more pieces in here than any one artist. And it's simply because by that point, I think they had bigger accounts that Maurice Logan felt he was the one who should be working on, and he dumps it on the lesser guy of Willard to do this. And also, Willard did better still lifes. But here's what Maurice Logan's other work looked like out there in the world. I mean, the guy was incredible. You know, this is one of his paintings. You know, he did a lot of posters for railroads. You know, those beautiful things we look at, admire and stuff, the WPA stuff. He did a lot of that stuff. He did really, really gorgeous stuff. Watercolors. Those are watercolors. You know? That's amazing. He also did magazine covers for corporations back then, oil companies. That was good pay. He had a few accounts like that. He could have retired early. Oh, I think he did. Here's what his watercolors look like. Again, you know, I want to apologize for the color quality. This isn't the way that it looked when I found it. It just has gotten very washed out. But you can see he was really good. He knew what he was doing. And if any of you have ever dabbled in watercolors and how difficult they are to do, these guys were good, you know. Now here's Willard Cox's stuff. You can see he was more of a still life kind of guy. Willard Cox, that one is on the wall right over there. What are those? Peonies? No, those are flowers. Willard Cox didn't always want to bother with the diffraction through the bottle either. He's the one who did this. This was probably his own fishing hat. You know, these guys were just good old boys, you know, good old American vets. And he did this one. But here's what some of his other work looked like again. Again, he was working on the Standard Oil project right alongside Maurice Logan. Here's another one. His illustrations of people tended to have a more cartoony quality. They weren't as sculpted or realistic looking. But he could still do stuff that had that kind of impact. These are all lost styles. I don't know anybody, and I know thousands of illustrators, and I don't know anybody who can do stuff like this. It just is gone. Paul Carey was another one of the guys that Maurice Logan dragged into the Society of Six Illustrators, and as a result would freelance for Logan and Cox. And he, again, I could only find a photograph of him earlier or later in years, but he was primarily he was really a painter. He didn't want to do illustration, and he stopped doing it very quickly. He became he ended up teaching at CCAC and Cal Arts and the University of California at Berkeley, and he became pretty much a teacher of art. But he did some of this stuff. That one's got some mold growing on it. That's what those dots are. But the dogwood image. You can see his type isn't as crispy either. He wasn't as good at like painting type. When you stop and think about actually sitting down and painting lettering, you know, some people have a knack and some people don't. You can teach yourself if you really want to spend a lot of time, but these guys didn't want to. He was a watercolor artist. This is the next guy I want to show. I could not find a photo of Arnie. Arnie Jensen turns out to be a fairly common name. Who would have guessed? He lived in Seattle. These other guys all lived in California so far, except for Edwin Burnley, who started that school in Seattle. This guy was a Seattle guy. The ad agency Seattle office would hire locally, and as a result was hiring people back in the 40s and 50s after the war that today are like, you know, we don't even know who they are. It's that big blank spot in the history of graphic design and illustration, particularly in the Northwest. This is Arnie Jensen. Arnie Jensen he was the go-to guy for painting beach scenes and sailboats. He did like most of that campaign over there in the 30s. Did wonderful still lifes. But this is what Arnie Jensen's work looked like. Again, working in that same popular American illustration style. But what's interesting about Arnie Jensen is that he did, you might notice there's a piece of tape stuck on the thing. See, these guys, this artwork wasn't respected. You'll find pieces of tape and writing on these things. It just went in the garbage after they were done with it, and here it is somehow. There was a famous sailboat designer named Arnie Jensen, and there's so many Arnie Jensens, I can't quite make the connection yet. But I think he went from drawing sailboats into making sailboats. And I think that's what happened to Arnie Jensen. But here's some of his other work. I mean, he did really elegant work. Notice the way he dealt with the refraction through see how the bowl comes through as that weird distortion, which is probably very realistic. Here's another one. I did these wonderful still lifes. It's fun to look at the titles on the books or the names on the packaging. You know, it's like they put in little jokes. A lot of these guys would put their buddies' initials in there. There's one in here that has a fishing license in it, and it's his business partner's fishing license. You know? One of them actually, there's one of them that has a hat with a button on it or something that says "Vote UCG" or something. It's some proposition that the guys were about. So I mean, they'd throw in the little jokes, but I mean, they had to be really clever about it because those guys would get caught, and they don't want to lose the account. This is the Depression, mind you. They needed this money. This is a guy named Rudy Bundes. Rudolf Bundes. He was originally from Hungary, learned art in Cleveland, and then moved to the Northwest during the war, stationed at Fort Lawton, and just said, "Hey, I like it here." Rudy did this. This is some of Rudy's work. You know, really beautiful stuff. What's interesting about his work to me is how flat it is. He doesn't really work with stereoscopic depth. All his images have this real flat, modernistic kind of feel to it that we all appeal to because it looks like cartooning. It looks like a lot of the illustration we've dealt with for decades here. There's a specific reason why Arnie Bundes had work. He was from Seattle. You know, he lived in Seattle. When he was a kid in Hungary, he had an accident and lost an eye. He was a one-eyed illustrator, dude. So what he's doing is he paints what he sees. And you lose that stereoscopic depth of vision, you know? So that's why it looks that way, the incredible flatness of that. Here's a piece he did for their newsletter, the Olympia newsletter. See what I'm talking about, flat? There's just no real stereoscopic depth that we see with our eyes. Close one eye and look at the world. He also did stuff for other people, Ford Times magazine, and during World War II, that's when he first got his attention as an artist because he started sketching his fellow soldiers in the European theater, and the expressions he would capture on their faces so moved people that he became well known for this sort of work, and that's what kind of launched his career later in life. Another interesting story about Rudy Bundes, and this is something, actually finding information on Rudy Bundes turned out to be fairly easy to do. There was a lot out there online. Apparently he was a bit of a publicity hound. He was always promoting himself. You know, he was a watercolor artist. I'll show you next one of the watercolor artists. One of his bios and one of his articles I read, he claimed to have created the Olympia beer logo, which is kind of hard to imagine because it probably predates his existence by about 25, 30 years. Another thing he claimed was that he did a lot of portraits of powerful politicians, and he was quite proud of having done a portrait of LBJ. He also did Scoop Jackson and Warren Magnuson and William Proxmire and Ed Muskie and George McGovern and Mo Udall, and it's quite a list, you know. So one of the things I really wanted to find was that LBJ image to show you, because, I mean, that's no small thing to do a live portrait of a president, you know. But I couldn't find it. I mean, I must have looked at 500 different images of LBJ, photographs, paintings, illustrations, cartoons. I could not find anything that was attributed, or George McGovern, or William Proxmire, or Scoop, or Jackson, or Maggie, or any of these people. I think, even though it's unsigned and uncredited, that this might be his portrait of LBJ. But it's really hard to tell. I think these might have been things he did at home and tried to... A lot of illustrators have to hustle hard to give themselves respectability in order to land the work. And I don't know, maybe he was puffing himself a little bit there. But he was an interesting character, and I just don't know much more about him. Here's one of his watercolors. I mean, he'd do these brightly colored watercolors like the Pike Place Market and stuff like that, and sell to tourists. He did okay. This guy's name is Merlin. Yes, I gotta tell you, I gotta look at his name here in order to pronounce it. Merlin, his last name was Inabnit. Merlin Inabnit. Say that 3 times real fast. Merlin Inabnit, when I started researching this guy, proved to be really, really interesting. interesting because Merlin and Abnett, here's a couple of his pieces. I think this was done in watercolor or maybe oils. A lot of these are gouache. It's basically mixed media. What do you call the label there on the beer bottle is literally glued on, and the type is probably stuck on with a piece of, these are all mixed media. They were never meant to be seen in this way. They were meant to be reproduced on something else. These are intermediary phases. But Merlin was a real hustler. This guy, he went out and he got the work. He built entire separate careers apart from picking up advertising illustration. He did pinups. He was a pinup guy. Now, this is a little naughty to be showing a crowd here, but I think you guys are all mature enough to understand what this means. He also did, magazine covers. That's Merlin and Abnett in action. And notice again the unfinished drapery. It's the same technique he did on that. See that little gimmick? And it was something he used a lot. This is a hosiery ad selling nylon stockings. This is a cover of a magazine called Fate magazine, which was kind of a weird crackpot flying saucer ghost magazine, But he did really, that's really exquisite stuff, even by today's standards. That's nice. That's really nice. But what he really made his money at, you ever go into an art supply store and they have a rack full of these how to paint flowers, how to paint dogs, how to paint children, how to paint landscapes? They're made by a company called Walter T. Foster Company. Look up there. By Merlin and Abnett, the color wizard. He made, most of his money selling these books. Here's another one. There's a signature, Merlin and Abnett. He was one of those guys. And yet he was this exquisite illustrator. Did stuff like that. Painting for Pleasure by Merlin and Abnett. God, I hope I'm pronouncing it. His last name's probably pronounced something like Johnson. But and even with the pinups and the Oli beer ads and these how-to books, he still needed to make money. So he did a lot of, I guess I lost that. I had a picture of a clown. He did a lot of clown paintings, scary clowns. That whole style that was around for about 20, 30 years back in the mid-century. He did a lot of really scary-looking clowns that he would sell as cheap prints that you could hang in your bedroom. I don't know. Now, this is Lonnie B. That's him in the middle there. At least I think it is. All indications is that is a picture of Lonnie B. Lonnie B is another illustrator. We've got some of his pieces in here. He's the only, you notice on the wall in there, there's about 4 paintings that are on stretched canvas. He was the only guy, we've got about a dozen of them down in the basement. He was the only guy of all these artists that worked on canvas for some reason. That was just what he chose to work on. There's a few of his other pieces in here that he did that are on board like these. But he considered himself, I think he was working in oils a lot too, and it just works better with the stretched canvas. He also did a lot of sporting imagery. You'll see what I mean. But it is, photographed with some interesting. It's a photograph I don't have an explanation for, but it's really intriguing. He's the one who did this one. Hey, honey, I brought home some beer. Oh, I'll put it in the refrigerator for you, dear. Golly, Mr. Wizard. Oh, honey, this beer tastes so good. Oh, that's so great. I'm cooking dinner for you. This is Lonnie B's stuff. It's like. His envision for Olympia tended to be really heavy-handed like that. And whether they wanted him or directed him to kind of go with this, or it's just a reflection of the times, this is the kind of stuff you probably get pilloried for today. Lonnie B did a lot of magazine work. Old Vanity Fair. He was around a long time. But, interestingly enough, he did a lot of Saturday Evening Post covers. Now, we tend to look at Saturday Evening Post and we assume Norman Rockwell did all of them. Well, no, Norman Rockwell didn't even do the majority of them. There were lots of different illustrators who worked in that style because that was a very popular illustration style, as you can see from that era, and all of it's been lost and undocumented. So Norman Rockwell, who was a great hustler, he was always promoting himself really hard, became the most famous of this style, and now we all soon see this look, we think Norman Rockwell. This look, no, this is Lonnie B. And he's just one of many. Here's another. There's another. Isn't that cool? Anything with flying bowling pins in it really turns my crank, I'll tell you. Look at the marbled ball. That's so, no, sorry. Here's another magazine that's just basically the same kind of, magazine. Anybody would look at that and say Norman Rockwell. But, he would also, in the later eras, he would do things like that. That would almost fit in that old Olympia campaign back there, And also he did stuff like this. I mean, basically he would pick up, anything that had like this kind of thing. And it's just really wonderful illustrator, prolific. Some of these illustrators, guys like Cox and Logan and Lonnie B, just cranked stuff out. They were just producing and producing and producing. It's like Lonnie B probably did hundreds of Saturday Evening Post covers. It's just astonishing. This guy's name is Richard Wiley. Again, he was from Portland, Richard Wiley, I think, was a heck of a nice guy. I mean, look at that smile. What a sweetie poops, huh? Yeah. Now, Richard Wiley tended to do this. He did a lot of the stuff in here. He tended to have these like normal middle-class American white people. It's one of the interesting things I find about his work is the women whose faces is virtually the same woman over and over, same face each time. And I think that was his wife, But this is part of that campaign. The guy's holding a saw and he's sawing nothing. He's just being a manly man, Mr. Fix-It, I'll bring you some beer, dear. Here's another one. Here's a happy guy on the beach. This looks like that character from Mad Men, doesn't it? I swear to God. That might have been a self-portrait. A lot of these guys would simply, to get the faces they needed, would look at America because it was handy, Here's another one. This is a lot of people's favorite one. It's just kind of a beautiful dang thing. He somehow has managed to pack his groceries in that bag with the Olympia beer case on top. The eggs are on the bottom, folks. But Richard Wiley, we all are very familiar with. We know this guy's work. He's the guy who did, wait a sec. He did a lot of sportswear stuff, Jansen, White Stag, down in Portland. Here's some more things. This look familiar? Yeah. He did Dick and Jane. I had no idea that a guy from Portland drew all those books. Did you? I mean, we all learned to read looking at his pics. I mean, that's just astonishing. And here he's on the side doing ads for Olympia beer. It's just amazing. Here's another page. Again, bad repro. Okay. So this is my last slide. I want to try and get across the impact that Olympia beer had and its marketing and imagery. I mean, my grandmother wore hats like this, okay? Literally, she made them herself, and she wore them. In fact, she came to my wedding wearing one of those. But everybody who grew up around here, spent any time, they remember those hats. What were those things about? Who came up with that idea, and why? So that's pretty much what I have to. Hopefully you picked a few things out of. When you go back before you leave, you'll probably take another look here at some of these things and maybe look at them a little differently. Now you know some of the personalities and quirks behind the guys who actually did this stuff. And again, I want to thank John and Karen and of course Aaron and Megan for not throwing this stuff out, which they could have. Different people looking at it. Different people may have said, "What is this junk? Let's toss it," So the fact that this is saved, I think this would make a great book project. I think it's absolutely fabulous. And it's kind of a miracle it survived, okay? Appreciate it.